You know what finally made me rethink how I build things? I was visiting a restored pioneer homestead out in southern Missouri a few years back. They had a small woodshop set up the way it would have looked around 1840 or 1850. Hand tools on the wall, a shaving horse in the corner, a couple of rough-sawn planks leaning against the beam. And I looked around that shop and realized something that hit me harder than I expected. Not a single thing in that room would be familiar to most modern woodworkers. No plywood, no plastic bottles of finish, no bin of screws. And yet the furniture those people built was still standing, still solid, 170 years later. Meanwhile, I've got a bookshelf in my garage from 20 years ago that's already sagging in the middle. That got me thinking about what pioneer woodworkers would never have allowed in their shops. And more importantly, why? Not just because those things didn't exist yet, but because the principles those craftsmen lived by would have rejected them outright. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 modern materials and methods that would have had no place in a frontier woodshop. And I think by the end, you'll start seeing your own shop a little differently. Plus, stick around to the end, because I've got a tip about selecting lumber the way pioneers actually did, that I guarantee you've never seen in a modern woodworking book. Let's get into it. Pioneer woodworking is one of those traditions that gets overlooked because people assume it was crude. It wasn't. These were people who built with intention, with intelligence, and with an understanding of wood that most of us have lost. Once you look at what they refused to rely on, you start to understand just how much we've traded away for convenience. So let me give you a little context first. When we talk about pioneer woodworkers, we're talking about men and women on the American frontier, roughly 1800 through 1880, who had to build everything they needed from what was available: furniture, cabinets, tool handles, wagon parts, barn doors, window frames. All of it came from local timber: white oak, black walnut, yellow poplar, eastern white pine, hickory. They didn't have a lumber yard down the road. They felled their own trees, split their own planks, and seasoned their own wood, sometimes for a year or more, before they'd use it. Their tools were simple but effective: a broadaxe for hewing, a draw knife for shaping, a frame saw or pit saw for ripping boards, hand planes for smoothing, chisels and mallets for joinery. No electricity, no dust collection, no quick trips to the hardware store. And here's the thing that matters. These weren't uneducated people fumbling through the process. Many frontier craftsmen had apprenticed back east or in Europe before heading west. They carried real knowledge with them. The philosophy was straightforward. Use solid wood. Join it properly. Finish it simply. Build it to last, because you might not get a second chance at the materials. That philosophy, that respect for the material and the process, is exactly why certain modern products would never have made it through the door of a pioneer shop. Not because they didn't exist yet, but because they violate everything those craftsmen believed about honest work. The first thing you would never find in a pioneer woodshop is MDF, or particle board. And I don't just mean because it hadn't been invented yet. I mean because the entire concept would have been offensive to someone who understood wood the way those craftsmen did. MDF is sawdust and glue pressed into a sheet. Particle board is wood chips and resin. Neither one has any grain structure. Neither one holds a fastener with any real authority. And neither one can handle moisture without swelling, crumbling, or falling apart. A pioneer woodworker selected every board by hand. He looked at the grain direction, checked for twist, tested the weight to judge how well it had dried. He understood that wood's strength comes from its fiber structure, from those long, continuous fibers running the length of the board. MDF has none of that. It's wood that's been destroyed and reconstituted into something that only looks flat and uniform. A pioneer would have looked at a sheet of MDF the way you'd look at someone trying to build a bridge out of paper mache. It might hold shape for a while, but it has no integrity. And for people who built furniture that had to survive wagon travel, brutal winters, and daily use for decades, integrity wasn't optional. The second thing you'd never find is polyurethane finish. Now, I'll be honest, I used polyurethane on everything for about 15 years. It's easy to apply, it's durable, and it gives you that thick, glossy surface that looks protective. But when I started studying how pioneers finished their furniture, I realized they had a completely different relationship with wood surfaces. They used linseed oil, tung oil, beeswax, and sometimes milk paint. These are finishes that soak into the wood rather than sitting on top of it like a plastic shell, and there's a real structural reason why that matters. Polyurethane creates a film that seals the wood surface completely. Sounds good in theory, but wood moves. It expands and contracts with humidity changes. A rigid plastic film on top of a living material is a recipe for cracking, peeling, and flaking over time. Pioneer finishes moved with the wood. Linseed oil penetrates the fibers and hardens slowly, giving the wood protection from the inside while still allowing it to breathe. A coat of beeswax on top of that gives you a soft, warm sheen that you can renew in 5 minutes with a rag. I've started finishing most of my projects this way, and the surfaces feel better, look better, and age more gracefully than anything I ever coated in polyurethane. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Old Ways, and it is a collection of 100 forgotten woodworking secrets from traditional craftsmen around the world. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third thing that would never show up in a pioneer shop is drywall screws. Now, this one might surprise some people because screws seem like a basic fastener, but drywall screws are made from hardened, brittle steel. They're designed to hold gypsum board to wood studs, and that's it. They have no business being inside a piece of furniture. They snap under lateral stress. They have no shear strength to speak of, and their coarse threads tear through wood fibers rather than gripping them cleanly. Pioneer woodworkers joined their furniture with mortise and tenon joints, dovetails, wooden pegs, and when they did use metal fasteners, they used cut nails or hand-forged nails that were made from softer iron and could flex without breaking. A pegged mortise and tenon joint in white oak will outlast any screwed connection by a century, and I'm not exaggerating. I've seen pioneer furniture with joints still tight after 150 years. I've also seen modern cabinets held together with drywall screws that started wobbling after 3 years. The difference isn't skill, it's philosophy. The fourth thing you'd never find is pocket hole joinery. Now let me be clear, I'm not saying pocket hole jigs are useless. They have their place for quick utility projects. But the idea of drilling an angled hole and driving a screw at a steep angle into end grain would have made a pioneer craftsman shake his head. End grain has almost no holding power. The fibers run parallel to the screw, so there's nothing to grip against. A pocket hole joint relies entirely on that screw and a little glue to hold two boards together. Compare that to a mortise and tenon, where you've got a long grain to long grain glue surface and a mechanical interlock that resists pulling apart in every direction. Pioneer furniture was expected to be moved, bumped, loaded with heavy dishes, and used hard every single day. A pocket hole joint wouldn't survive that kind of life. The old-timers didn't use complicated joinery because they enjoyed making things difficult. They used it because it was the only way to make something that would actually hold together. The fifth thing is wood filler and putty. This is one that really changed how I think about my own work. In a modern shop, if you've got a gap in a joint or a tear out on a surface, you reach for a can of wood filler and nobody thinks twice about it. But in a pioneer shop, a gap in a joint meant the joint was wrong. You didn't fill it. You fixed it. You recut the tenon. You refitted the dovetail. You started over if you had to. Because filler doesn't add strength. It just hides the evidence of a poor fit. And in a world where your furniture had to survive without easy replacement, hiding a weak joint behind putty was the same as lying about the quality of your work. This pushed me to raise my own tolerance for fit. I still make mistakes, but I stopped reaching for the filler can as a first response, and my joinery has gotten measurably better because of it. The sixth thing is relying on power sanders as a finishing step. Now, pioneers obviously didn't have power sanders, but that's not the point. The point is how they achieved a finished surface. They used a hand plane. A well-tuned smoothing plane with a sharp iron leaves a surface that's genuinely superior to a sanded surface. When you sand wood, you're scratching the fibers with abrasive particles. Even at 220 grit, you're leaving thousands of tiny scratches that dull the wood's natural luster. A hand plane severs the fibers cleanly, leaving a surface that reflects light evenly and feels almost like glass under your fingertips. I didn't believe this until I tried it side by side. I planed half a board of black walnut and sanded the other half up to 320 grit. The planed side had a depth and clarity that the sanded side simply couldn't match. Pioneer woodworkers knew this instinctively. A sharp blade was the final word on surface quality, not a grit progression. The seventh thing you would never find is construction-grade lumber pulled straight off the rack and used immediately. Today, most of us go to the home center, pick through the stack for the straightest boards we can find, and bring them home to use that weekend. Pioneer craftsmen would have been horrified by that. They felled trees during specific seasons, usually late fall or winter when the sap was down. They split or sawed the logs into planks and then stacked them with spacers in between, called stickers, to allow air to circulate evenly. The wood air-dried for months, sometimes over a year, depending on thickness. 1 inch of thickness generally needed about 1 year of drying. This slow seasoning allowed the wood to reach equilibrium with its environment gradually, which meant far less warping, checking, and movement after the piece was built. When I started buying rough lumber and letting it acclimate in my shop for at least a month before milling it, the difference in stability was remarkable. That one change alone reduced the number of problems I had with joints opening up after the fact. Let me share some patterns I've noticed in my own work over the years. Things I used to do that pioneer woodworking taught me to reconsider. The first pattern is reaching for the fastest option instead of the strongest one. I used screws because they were quick. I used plywood because it was flat. I used polyurethane because it dried hard. Every one of those choices prioritized my time over the life of the piece. The second pattern is trusting the material without questioning it. I'd buy lumber and use it the same day without checking moisture content, without letting it acclimate, without even thinking about what that wood was going to do 6 months from now. Pioneer woodworkers never made that mistake because they couldn't afford to. The third pattern is hiding mistakes instead of correcting them. Every time I reached for wood filler, I was telling myself the joint was good enough. It wasn't. The fourth pattern is skipping the hand tool step. I stopped using hand planes because power sanders were faster. But faster isn't better when the result is inferior. Once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start changing them. Not all at once. One project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I learned from reading first-hand accounts of frontier craftsmen, and it completely changed how I select lumber. Pioneer woodworkers didn't just look at a board. They flexed it. They would pick up a plank, support it at both ends, and press down in the middle to feel how it responded. A board that flexed evenly and sprang back was considered sound and well-seasoned. A board that felt dead or stiff in spots, or that flexed unevenly, told them the grain was irregular or the moisture content wasn't uniform. I started doing this at the lumber yard, and I was shocked at how much information you can get from a simple flex test. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells you more about that board's internal structure than staring at the face grain ever will. Try it next time you're picking through a stack. You'll start feeling the difference between a board that wants to cooperate and one that's going to fight you the whole way through a project. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Old Ways. 100 techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with step-by-step photos and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one.